Scott here again on Flip That Script to talk to you more about my earlier life and the time leading up to when I first went no contact, which was March of 2020. A couple of things that I wanted to add in is that although my father was very largely aloof, I guess they kind of talk about that on these kind of channels as being emotionally unavailable. Didn't really attune to me, didn't seem interested in what was going on with me in my inner world. And as I mentioned, never really gave me praise or positive feedback as I became a accomplished piano player and also consistently an honor student, and always pretty much what people would call an easygoing kid, low maintenance, well behaved. I believe at this point that's probably all being rewritten, of course. There were a few incidents that I recall that were kind of vivid, where my father showed kind of how cruel and dismissive and critical he could be, although the vast majority of the time he just stayed aloof. I recall an incident before we moved, which was when I was about 10. I think I must have been maybe 5 or 6 at the time, where my father kept trying to spank me with like the bristles of a hairbrush, and I kept insisting that I wasn't wrong and I didn't do whatever it was. I don't even recall what it was, but I now know with absolute certainty and clarity, because I don't have a problem acknowledging if I'm in the wrong, that it must have been a false accusation or greatly exaggerated. Then I recall an incident after we moved to a larger home. My father started to get very successful in business. We moved to a large home and he started driving high-end cars. Where he wanted me to fill up a hoop with firewood that was sitting behind our garage, not too far off from our back porch. And I recall cussing him out and running out into the yard. Some of that's a little blurry to me too, but I was an easygoing kid and I think he was quite shocked. And then he sat down on the steps and played victim, even though I'm sure I must have been reacting to some pretty excessive criticism, perhaps some perfectionism that he was expecting out of me, because that's not a difficult task. Not that complicated. Speaking of things that aren't that complicated, I remember a time that he wanted me to shovel the sidewalk after a big snowstorm. Out front, there was a sidewalk that ran off of the front porch and went out sideways from the front porch at the bottom of the steps out to the driveway. He must have done more than half the job showing me how to shovel a sidewalk. Really complicated. I think what you do is you fill the shovel up and you throw it off to the side. He really tried to make me feel like an idiot, which I think was at the root of the incident with filling the hoop with firewood from behind the garage. Neither are that complicated of a task. There are recollections of maybe a few times that he did something with me. I recall once in a while getting to ride with him to Dunkin' Donuts, which is about a 10-minute drive up the street, on Sunday mornings sometimes, and a few times going to the hardware store. I don't really have any recollections of him spending any quality time with me at home. My brother, as I mentioned, besides the drug problems and when he started um, being very verbally and emotionally abusive to our mother, he seemed to sometimes purposely seek me out just for the purposes of putting me down. From what I recall, a lot of these put downs were about being sensitive and just that I was a sweet kind of child, I guess. Soft hearted, into creative stuff like writing poetry, playing piano, and being a bookworm, stuff like that. And to him, that seemed to be worthy of put downs because I guess that wasn't macho enough. I'm not ashamed of the fact that I'm not like a macho man. Who cares? um, so we get up to, and I kind of covered this time a little bit, but I went away to college. My father rewrites that in his mind is that I didn't want to go away to college when in fact I did. I was looking forward to the adventure. And he was more trying to sway me towards going to the local college and commuting. I think he was just trying to save money. I can't necessarily judge that, but at the same time, my father was doing very, very well financially. When I went away to college, I think he came up with my mom to visit one time, other than when they first dropped me off there. I went out of state. Um, just a adjacent state to my home state. It's about a 2 hours from home. He came up to visit once. My mom would come up and visit periodically. Um, I would call home maybe once every week or so. This was back in the 80s, so there was just a payphone. There weren't such things as cell phones. I would call like once a week. And if I called and my dad answered, he would just say, "Here's your mom." He didn't really have any interest in talking to me. Um, so that's how things were. I went home for holidays. I ended up staying in my college hometown during the summers, except for that very first summer. At that point, when the first summer that I wanted to stay, he made a really big deal out of the fact that he wasn't going to give me money to pay my minimal expenses. And once I just told him that's fine, he kept re-emphasizing it, like it was that big of a deal. I was working some during the school year, and then I worked full-time during the summer. I got a job with the grounds crew at my college, and once I got that the first summer, they rehired me the next couple of summers. So it wasn't a problem to pay my own expenses for the summer, but he really seemed to want to make a big deal out of the fact that he wasn't going to be giving me money then. Should have been a simple cut and dry conversation where he would have just said, "Well, you're going to have to pay your own expenses," and I would have said okay, and that would have been it. But he seemed to rather perseverate on that, as I recall. Then most of my contact was with my mom. I still came home on breaks then, like winter break, Thanksgiving time, Christmas time, spring break maybe sometimes. Somewhere in that time, my brother was finally kicked out. I think, remembering that he was there that first summer, he must have kicked it out when he was more like 22 or 23. Then I stayed in my college town for the first few years after I graduated. I ended up working in group homes and working with special needs adults and children, various jobs, group homes, residential school, and so forth. Somewhere around that time, I think it was around 1990, my brother got busted for drugs, possession of cocaine with intent to distribute, and my father helped to finance him running away, becoming a fugitive, and taking on a fake, phony alias. Then it was a couple of years later, while I was working these jobs, that my mom became terminally ill with ovarian cancer. When the news was first given to me, he really minimized it and made it sound like she was just going to get treated and then she was going to be cured. This was before the age of the internet, so I wasn't really well aware that ovarian cancer, especially if caught later, is fatal. I believe it was caught late and the prognosis is bad. He probably to this day considers this to be that he was doing this for my own good, as toxic parents often do. That was for my own good to not tell me. Look at how much grief he saved me. I definitely feel like I was entitled to know the truth. The truth was not told to me until my mom gave up treatments after 8, 9, 10 months went by. And then she died November of 1992. My father very much controlled visitation. I only got to see her a couple of times during the last, I'd say 10, 15 weeks that she was very actively dying and became bedridden. My mother's brothers came down one day towards the beginning of when it was getting bad, but before she was bedridden. They came down by boat. My parents lived on the water and wanted to take her out for a boat ride. My dad essentially, from what I understand, I didn't find this out until like a year or two ago, told them to leave. Didn't give them a chance to be with her at the end, or before things got bad enough. In any case, it's emotional for me, even all these almost a little over 30 years later, to think about my mom's passing, because she was my good parent. At this time, my brother was a fugitive and came up. And at one point, the four of us sat there and held hands. And we all acknowledged that Mom was going to pass soon. When my mother passed, and this is a correction because I'm realizing and remembering another video, I misspoke. It was one of my mother's two younger brothers, the older of her two younger brothers, whose relationship with his wife at that time was on the rocks. She had been coming down to the house, putting cold cloths on my mother's head as she was dying in her last days. And my father ended up sleeping with her. From what I understand, this was definitely like within maybe 48 hours. It might have even been that first night. I was never clear on the story, but in any case, that's what he did. My father now says that he was fine right after Mom died. My father, and I'm not judging this is just for the record, he was very much an emotional wreck for about 2 years after Mom died, and he knew about a year ahead of time that she was going to die. And I only state that to clarify the record because of how hypocritical, toxic, and abusive parents and people in general can be. Because, as you know from previous videos, and I'll get into this more later, but when my wife died suddenly and without warning, he was expecting me to recover very quickly, whereas when my mom, his wife, was terminally ill and he knew a year ahead of time, he was still struggling emotionally a couple years after a passing with a 1-year warning. He stayed with her for a couple years and always talked to, well, let's move on a little bit. It was about 6 months or so after my mother's passing that I first went into business for myself. It's now going on, will soon be 30 years that I've been in business for myself with no outside employment. It was about a year after her passing that I met my future wife, Harleen. Later on, about a couple years after we were together, I had a waiting list of piano students, and I convinced her to quit her sales job and to join me in teaching piano. She took students on my waiting list, then we started advertising jointly. And then before another year or so was out, we had a joint waiting list, and that's when we decided to hire other people to work for us as independent contractors, visiting people's homes to give piano lessons. And within a few years, we had over a few hundred students. My father's only real reference to all these years in business was about how a few years or a year or two after our business had gotten so large and successful, large volume, that we decided to franchise our business. We ended up selling 5 franchises, no longer in operation. Nobody was really as dedicated to it as we were. At the time, it turned out that my wife was becoming manic, and that played very largely into the fact that we went bankrupt. We ended up borrowing money on credit cards. Back then, I guess it's still the case now, I don't know. But there were special offers of, being 0% for a year or 18 months or 6 months and so forth. But as she became increasingly manic, she was unrealistic about the time that was needed and the kind of advertising budget that was needed, which would have necessitated that we don't have her daughter working in our office. That's all water under the bridge, but her thinking was distorted and she was manic. She ended up being incarcerated because of violating a peace order, and she was behaving like manic people do. She was getting a little overly involved and meddlesome with a family that she was working with, and was trying to tell the parent how to treat her teenage son. So after she got better, she realized how inappropriate it was, but she was in a manic state that contributed to our bankruptcy. And I can say all the way up to when I went no contact in the spring of 2020, that incident and all that transpired, going on about 20 years or so, would be brought up frequently. So the only thing that can really be said about me in almost 30 years in business is that I, not Harleen and I jointly, and then of course taking it out of context of her being mismedicated by a doctor and becoming manic, just that I got myself into a lot of debt. Around that time, my father gave me like $1,000 once while she was in jail, and still can't stop congratulating himself about that. Not that I wasn't grateful for it. I'm just talking about how narcissistic people view themselves. He, later on, when we ended up declaring bankruptcy, and that took a few years, and we should have done it earlier, and I was pushing my wife to do that earlier, as she was getting more and more grounded when she was put on medication for bipolar. Her bipolar was diagnosed as a result of all of this. He had also paid, I think, what amounted to a couple $1,000s back in those days to the lawyer who was supposed to represent her during her incarceration and the trials and all that kind of stuff. He later on believed not only that he paid the bankruptcy lawyer, which was a totally different person, which he didn't, but that because of that, he's responsible for saving us all that money. So, definitely a lot of distorted thinking with people that are toxic and narcissistic and abusive. It was shortly before we had went into the franchising and got into all that debt that we couldn't get out of because of her manic state and her inability to look at the way that we could have then done what was needed to get out of the debt and avoid bankruptcy. We adopted our son from Russia. That was in 2000. We traveled there. Now to backtrack a little bit and talk about my brother. My brother cleared up his fugitive state, turned himself in, and then, with what my father told me, God, not until probably around the time of Harlene's passing, or it might even been a little bit later. I think it was later because I don't recall ever sharing that with her. My father bribed a judge to clear things up. He ended up serving less than a year for having had a large amount of cocaine and being a fugitive for 5 years. I always thought that seemed a little bit of a light sentence. I'm sure you all would agree. So that made sense when I found that out. Before I really woke up to the narcissism and what it is and why my relationships with my father and brother always seemed off, he wanted to use that information to try to triangulate, because of course he wanted to tell my brother and to try to convince him that it's true. My brother, for some reason, has himself convinced that that's not true. Now, how anybody in their right mind could think they could be caught with a large amount of cocaine with intent to distribute and be a fugitive for like 5 years and then serve a sentence of less than a year without there being some bribery involved is beyond me. I never really thought about it too much, but I knew something wasn't right. But my relationship with my brother was not such that I was overly concerned about it. Now, when Harlene and I first got married and my brother had come up and cleared things up, I guess within around that first year that we were married, Harlene approached me and said that during when he visited us that he had taken her aside and solicited her and let her know that if I ever failed her in the bedroom, that he'd be happy to fill in. Isn't that nice? For the next couple of decades or longer, because this was 1995 and went no contact in 2020, I am the one that always initiated any contact with my brother. I'm the one who visited him. I'm the one that sent birthday cards. he never showed much interest, and when I visited him, he would always ask detailed questions about the business, how many teachers we had, how many students we had. Later on, he would rewrite history to say that I was always bragging about my business, even though he was the one asking the questions and I was simply answering them. And I usually had, working with that volume of people, there was always an interesting story or two about dealing with difficult people. I just wanted to share that and then move on to other topics and see what was going on with him and so forth. Apart from that, here's what these visits consisted of. They usually consisted of my brother going on and on and on and on about how much he had saved a lot of money and made a lot of money in the stock market. And when I say on and on and on and on, I mean like you could have a 2-hour visit and he would just go on talking about that, and always talking about why other people aren't, and how he has more money than his boss, and about how he kept trying to get his co-workers to invest in the stock market, and how just laughing at them and snickering about how like he was doing better than them, and how come every week goes by and they say I only have $10 to last me till next payday and stuff like that. Like very like to me it now makes sense once I learned about the whole black and white thinking and winners and losers and the whole hierarchy and needing to puff themselves up and put others down. The whole thing with my wife's breaking the peace order on our bankruptcy, as I mentioned, is the whole way that my father and brother pretty much summarize my what is now going on nearly 30 years in business. It's really quite silly and ridiculous. That's pretty much went on for 20 some years. And my father rarely called me. I quickly learned not to call him too often, because if I did, or even called him within maybe even 3 weeks of last time I talked to him, he'd be like, "What are you calling about? We just talked." I'm laughing now, but I've done a lot of healing. Obviously didn't want to have a close relationship. If I didn't call him, because I did a test a few times, it would take him about 5 months to call. My brother took like about 5 years before he came and first visited our house when Harley and I had bought a house in 2008. Neither one ever really formed any kind of close relationship or bond with our son Stevie. As far as I'm concerned, adults, somebody in the role of grandfather or uncle, are supposed to bond with their nephew or grandson and make them feel special and loved and wanted. They never did that, so I just wanted to throw that in there, that as far as me going no contact with them, he's completely indifferent, because there was nothing there, and that was their responsibility to show him love and to make him feel special and to form the bond. That's not up to a little 2 and 3-year-old to play adult and make the adults feel special. And that's ass backwards, upside down. As I mentioned, just a few other things I want to throw in there, but I can just tell you that for 20 some years, my relationship with my father and brother was always strained. They still always put me down, always found things to nitpick and be critical about. And as you know from other videos, when Harleen passed away, they did not exactly behave in ways that I would say were very becoming of a loving family member when a family member loses a spouse of 23 years so suddenly. So I think I provided a lot of other details about what happened from that point on. I started visiting my brother less and less frequently, and then at some point around the time that my brother lost his wife in 2013, and I think it was maybe a year or so before that that my father got involved and started wanting my brother and I to start having regular, some kind of lunches together. Why he's supposed to exert that control is just something that fits in with narcissism. Because he was acting like he wanted us to be close, but in my recollection, he did what you often read narcissistic parents do, which is triangulating and trying to drive a wedge between their children, not have them be close. So, you've heard all the things about what happened after my wife's, Harlene's, passing, and the things leading up to when I got engaged, and then my decision to go no contact. So my next video that I'll do within a week, maybe a day or two less than that, maybe even just the next few days, but within a week you should expect one more video that's about my post no contact, in which I might also briefly go back over the caveat to that, which I talked about a little bit. And after that, I'm going to do some videos to help talk to you about what kinds of things you're going to do to make things better for you, considering the fact that unfortunately you have one or more toxic family members. Peace out.